few lessons about widows and widowhood and get you familiar with various aspects of this. And in the weeks to come, I don't know if we're going to have maybe one more lesson, maybe two. We'll just see however many the Lord has for us. But I'd like to at least address three things. I might be able to put two of these together. Tonight, I just want to get you familiar with the heart of God as it pertains to widows. Now imagine, guys, just hypothetically, if God were to come and sit down and say, ask me anything you want, learn how I feel about things. We'd have a lot of questions, right? There'd be a lot of things we'd ask. But if you were to ask God, what really is close to your heart? What situation, when you look down from heaven and you look around on the earth and you look for situations that are really heartbreaking, God, what really grabs a hold of your heart? And I think you're going to see tonight, widows is right there at the top of the list. It's something that is very near and dear to His heart. So we want to get familiar with what God says about it, how He feels about it. And then we'll also eventually look at what Jesus had to say about it while He was on the earth. And then we're going to spend some time in the New Testament looking at what a church is supposed to do about it. So hopefully tonight we learn some very broad and maybe general truths about it. But please understand, as we're learning the heart of God on this matter, always be thinking in the back of your mind, now me personally, what can I do to contribute to this situation? How can I make a difference perhaps in the area of widows? Me personally, you guys help me out. I'd like to know, how many of you have ever sat through a lesson or a series of lessons about biblical widowhood? All right, this will be the first time for all of us then. I have never heard this lesson. I've never heard a sermon about it. I've never read a book about it. Oh, well, okay, I've read this book, but I've never read a book just about widowhood, and yet it's going to happen to everyone eventually. You would like to think that we would be a little more clued in on that. So I think it's worth our time to look at this. So perhaps this is an oversimplification, maybe something too easy, but let's start with the definition. What is a widow? A widow is a woman who has lost her husband. Now I'm saying this, I know that's very apparent. If a widow gets remarried, technically she's no longer a widow. Right, technically. And that's good to know because as we approach the scripture and we read a widow should be treated like this or that, if she has remarried, then that's a different case. Now, we will not forget that she went through a very serious heartbreak in losing a husband at one time. So the pain of that is still going to be the same, but there's a different approach that we would take to helping somebody in that case. As I looked up the word widow just to see if there was more to the word, this is kind of a funny way to use it. There's not a whole lot of jokes you have with widows, right? There are very few jokes in widowhood. That's just not a time to joke around, is there? But this one time, have you ever heard of a golf widow? Have you heard the term used like that, a golf widow? So this is the woman who's stuck at home. Her husband's always on the course. So she's basically living in widowhood because the husband's never there. That's a golf widow. Okay, I grew up hearing that type of thing. But in this dictionary I looked at, they have a new entry now. Next to golf widow, they now have a video game widow. And I thought, how degenerate are we? We can't even get the men to go outside and play golf, right? They're sitting inside on the Xbox or whatever. Now, guys, I'm not preaching against golf or video games. I think there's a time and a place for both. But whenever your wife is living in practical widowhood because you're glued to a screen or hands glued to a club or whatever the hobby might be, we need to be a bit more present in our wives' lives. But let's look at it. I want to show you several verses of Scripture, so let me dive right in here. Exodus chapter 22, and this is definitely not a sermon tonight by any means. This is a Bible study in its rawest sense. Look at verse 18. And I want to show you here the soft spot in God's heart for widows. In verse 18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. I know it's a strange place to start, but I'm building to something, all right? Widows are not witches, don't worry. I'm not going there. Okay, now I made a joke. Oh, I wasn't supposed to do that, sorry. God takes sorcery very seriously. Do you see this? He's telling the nation of Israel, if somebody is a professing witch, they practicing witchcraft, then they need to be put to death. Now, this is the nation of Israel. This was their society at that time. I'm not saying we should institute the same laws in our church, but we learn something here about the mind and heart of God as it pertains to these things. He takes it seriously. Verse 19, whosoever lieth with a beast shall surely be put to death. Ugh. Moving right along. Verse 20, he that sacrificeth unto any god, save unto the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. I'm simply pointing out to you that there are some things where God has no leeway. He looks at that and he says, that's serious, that's disgusting, it must be dealt with. Okay? And he's very clear. Not a lot of explanation there. Verse 21, thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. I love this verse. There's a lot of these verses in the Old Testament especially because I've been a stranger now for 22 years. I've lived in somebody else's land. I didn't grow up in this side of the world, so I kind of fall into that stranger category. I just heard that as it came out of my mouth, but okay, there's a strange part to me as well. But the stranger, you're going to see that the stranger is often mentioned along with the fatherless and the widow, and we'll talk about why that is in a minute. All right, so God, He takes these areas, these issues quite seriously. Now look at verse 22. Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. The reason I read the other verses, right? Here's what you do with the witch. Here's what you do with sacrificing to other gods. And if you treat the stranger wrong, hey, shame on you. Now, if you dare touch a widow and bother her, I will kill you with the sword. I mean, he really lands hard on that. And it just shows you how important it is to God that they are properly taken care of. All right, so let's perhaps pose this question. Why? Why are widows and fatherless children, that's certainly part of this, but we're focusing on the widow aspect. Why is that something that is so intensely important to the Lord? Well, I'm going to put something out there just for food for thought. Is it perhaps their age? Now, not all widows are old. Right? You can be a widow and be very young. So when he says widows, that yes, often widowhood comes along with age. You often find widows advanced in their years. But even a young widow would deserve some mercy and special consideration. However, because the two often go together, God is very careful and He has this soft spot for people that are unable to care for themselves. And that's why a fatherless child and a widow and a stranger, because in a strange land, you don't have all the same rights to provide for yourself that you would in your homeland. And that's why when God sees somebody that is underprivileged in that sense, He expects other people around to be mindful that they can't take care of themselves and step in and take extra good care of them. Look at Leviticus chapter 19, just real quick. As it pertains to age, I think it's at least worth mentioning this while we're on the subject, because although not all widows are old, some are. And in these cases, you would have to take both parts into consideration. They're advanced in years, and they are without their husband. Think of this just quickly as well. A fatherless child and a widow, what are they missing? They're missing the man in their life. And I know this isn't politically correct, but I don't care about that. Men have an important role in the home. And I know the feminist movement is all about we don't need a man, we don't need men in our lives. Yes, you do. And men, we need the ladies in our lives. God put that woman there to be a helpmeet for us. God has built it. You can look at this in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, that the man needs the woman needs the man. This is God's plan, that we are dependent on each other. You take the man out of the home. He is to provide, he is to protect. Now, there's many other things he does, but providing and protecting. You take that out, and you're a child, and daddy's not there to protect you and provide. And now, you know what mama's going to have to do? She has to provide and protect. She wasn't built for that. And now she has to do all that and something else? That is brutal. That's brutal. A fatherless child, you understand, that's different than an orphan. That's an even more serious situation. But you take a widow who's now advanced in years, unable to get out and go grocery shopping. Unable. There's a knock at the gate, and she's scared to pieces to even open the curtain to see who's out there, because what if somebody's going to... It's not as if she can run away. Life at that stage, at that advanced age, and no man to protect and provide, there are so many things that you start to think of how am I going to make it? What am I going to do? Because for so many years, in many cases 40, 50 years, that's been his department. And now all of a sudden she has to do her part of life and his part. It's a lot. So when you mix widowhood and age, there's a lot to be expected here. Now, Leviticus 19, look at verse 32. Thou shalt rise up before the hoary head. Let you find that, verse 32. Thou shalt rise up before the hoary head. Hoary is like white hair. Thou shalt rise up before the hoary head and honor the face of the old man and fear thy God. I am the Lord. The Jews, they had a common way of practicing this. When they saw an older person approaching that had the white or the gray hair, once they got 2 meters away, the person in their presence would have to stand up and give them a proper greeting, just to recognize we are honoring, we're showing respect. Now, I'm not saying we have to honor the 2-meter thing, but there's a principle there. And it's worth noting. Look at Job chapter 32. And before you start to think, well, that was in the Old Testament, we're in the New Testament now, and Jesus, he took the law out of the way, nailed it to the cross. Hey, bro, old is still old. That didn't change when we got to the New Testament. Old people are still old. White hair is still white hair. That part didn't change, and there's certainly respect is still required. Job 32, read with me beginning at verse 1. So these 3 men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the kindred of Ram. Against Job was his wrath kindled because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his 3 friends was his wrath kindled because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken because they were elder than he. This is just good manners, isn't it? Let the older folks in the room say what they need to say first. Give them first dibs. Verse 5, now it says, when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these 3 men, then his wrath was kindled. And Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered and said, I am young, and ye are very old. That's in the Bible more than you would think. There are many times somebody comes up to another person and says, you are old. Which, I don't know how we can transfer that into our culture, but there it is. Ye are very old, wherefore I was afraid and durst not show you mine opinion. I dared not. I didn't do that. Verse 7, I said, days should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. Now, as he goes on, he will point out that just because you're old doesn't mean you're wise. It's not automatic, but we should give that person the benefit of the doubt that because they've been around a while, they have something to say. That's just being polite. Now, why would God build this into society and actually give a law in Leviticus about it? Well, think of it this way. A person gets a bit older, right? Now I'm thinking much older. Not just when you start to get gray hair. That's in your 40s sometimes. But much older. You're not able to take care of yourself the way you once did. You are dependent on somebody around you to pitch in and help out and to be merciful and patient. And there's nothing they can do about that. That's just part of it. And, as I mentioned earlier, give it enough time, you're going to be there. Just put yourself in that position. If I'm unable to do for myself what I've been doing for 50, 60 years. That level of frustration, the fact that somebody else would come in and patiently and respectfully deal with me, that would be a very big deal at that stage of life. But I like what one person said about this. We show the elderly respect because they built the world we now live in. You're living in their work. Now, you might say, well, they didn't build it. Okay, but they maintained it well enough so that you could step in, and now it's your turn to maintain it and hopefully leave something behind to the next generation. Try not to burn it down. Try not to mess it up so bad that your kids and their kids won't have any place to live and function. The fact that the older generation is now handing the baton to us, to this generation, saying, now, you guys run with it. Well, okay, that's not to say they did everything perfect, but there's something to work with, and we should be mindful of that. All right, so as I said, widowhood and age don't always go together, but there's certainly an overlap, and I'm sure you can recognize that. So, when Jesus was on the earth, we read that he looked around and he saw the people scattered, and it says they fainted because they were sheep that didn't have a shepherd. And I got to thinking about that. With a fatherless and a widow, you have a bit of that in there. The shepherd has passed. He was the one responsible to take care of the flock, and he's not there. And the Bible says Jesus, when he saw that condition, he was moved with compassion. It broke his heart to see people without that in their lives. Look at Psalm chapter 68. Psalm 68. Psalm 68, verse 5. I'm going to show you several verses now just to try to manifest the heart of God on this. Verse 5 says, forgive me, can we start at verse 4? Sing unto God, sing praises to his name, extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name, Jah. That's a shortened version of Jehovah. And rejoice before him. And then a description. A father of the fatherless and a judge of the widows is God in his holy habitation. So we extol him, we lift him up, and the first thing we praise him for is how he takes care of fatherless and takes care of widows. Because of those two groups, they are in desperate need of somebody to step in and provide something. The fatherless need a father. The widows, they need a judge. They need a judge. Why is this? Because widows generally, especially older, when they get older, it's easy to take advantage of them. They don't have the strength, the resources, or the experience to fight such legal battles. And people, you read in the New Testament where Jesus said, you devour widows' houses, religious leaders taking advantage of them. And God is very serious about that. He steps in and says, no, I'm not going to let you take advantage of these ladies. They are very vulnerable, therefore they need more protection. And God keeps a close eye on that. Look at Isaiah chapter 1. Tonight, guys, we're not getting into all the various levels that God has built into society to take care of a widow. We're going to get to that when we look at the New Testament. Tonight, we're just trying to get an idea of how serious this is to God. Isaiah 1, verse 17. Learn to do well. Isaiah, let you get it. I'm sorry. I'm going at Bible school speed. I need to slow down a little bit. Let's start reading at verse 16. Wash you, make you clean. Put away the evil of your doings from before mine eyes. Cease to do evil. Learn to do well. Seek judgment. Relieve the oppressed. Judge the fatherless. Plead for the widow. God said you need to learn how to do that. Do you see it in verse 17? Learn to do this. Learn to do well. All right, Lord, what's involved in that? Make sure that if the widow needs something, you stand up and plead for her and say, hey, not just plead like pray to God for her, but plead in court. Plead in some family situation to go, hey, this is your responsibility. You should be taking care of her, and stand up for her. Look at verse 23. He's explaining here how Jerusalem and how Israel has gone away from God. He says, thy princes are rebellious and companions of thieves. Everyone loveth gifts and followeth after rewards. You know what he's talking about? Corrupt politicians. There's 2 letters you might want to put in your margin right next to that, S-A. Anyway, sorry. It says, they judge not the fatherless, neither doth the cause of the widow come unto them. Now, here's something to pick up on. As I studied this out, it really sunk into me. Every time the nation of Israel backslid and got away from God, you always find this mentioned. They stopped taking care of the widows. Every time. They just stopped paying attention to people that really needed extra help. And that's why I think it's good if we as a church are mindful of how important that is, and let's see what we can learn to do to help them and plead for them. Look at Proverbs chapter 15. As far as a monthly initiative, I'm going to ask you to pray about it. Be a little creative here. And ask the Lord, and maybe talk with your family. What can we do? Can we give up one day of our, let's say not one day, but on one day of this coming month, can we do something for a widow? Not necessarily one in our church. We do have a few. But maybe you know of some widow in town, some family friend or something. Can we just go make somebody's day extremely special? And make it a family project. I think it would be a nice little ministry thing to do with your family. Proverbs 15, look at verse 25. The Bible says, the Lord will destroy the house of the proud, but he will establish the border of the widow. What is this? He puts boundaries around her. And he says, now, it's like a hedge of protection. I'm going to put a special boundary so that anybody trying to get in, I'm going to really drop the hammer on them. Now, there's different ways that God goes about establishing the border of a widow, making sure, in a technical sense, no one steals her land. That's the border he's dealing with. But in a broader sense, just overall protection, just being what she needs. There's things that God has built into society to establish the widow and make sure she's taken care of. So I'm going to take you back to the law. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 10. I want to show you several verses here that God commanded Israel, things that God commanded them to do to make sure the widows were taken care of. Deuteronomy chapter 10, and let's get verse 17. Deuteronomy 10, verse 17. All right, several things they're being told to do, talking about loving the Lord, etc. Many good things here, but verse 17 says, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, a great God, a mighty, and a terrible, which regardeth not persons, nor taketh reward. He's not corrupt. You can't bribe him. He's always going to do right. Terrible, we use that as a really bad negative thing. Terrible in the sense that he is able to invoke terror. He's big. He's fearful in that way, in the right way. All right, so we've just read, there's no full stop at the end of verse 17, right? God of gods, Lord of lords, a great God, verse 18. He doth execute the judgment of the fatherless and widow, and loveth the stranger in giving him food and raiment. He just makes sure they're taken care of. Do you see? He's a great God, God of gods, Lord of lords, mighty, terrible. All right, what's so great about him? He takes care of widows. Do you see how that always goes together? I think I've been guilty of just reading right past that too much. Look at chapter 24. Deuteronomy chapter 24. Verse 17. Deuteronomy 24, verse 17. He says here, thou shalt not pervert the judgment of the stranger, nor of the fatherless, nor take a widow's raiment to pledge. Why? Because she doesn't have much. You take that, this is all she has. You gotta have some mercy here. It's not as if she has a man in the house to go get more of this stuff. Verse 18, but thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee thence. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. So God tells them to think back to the time that their nation was in bondage and they were not able to take care of themselves. Their livelihood was somewhat out of their control. And he says, when you were in that desperate situation in Egypt, I stepped in and helped you out. Now I want you to remember that. When you see other people that their lives are out of control and they can't provide, you need to do the same thing for them that I did for you. Let's keep reading here, verse 19. When thou cuttest down thine harvest in thy field, and hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hands. So he says, if you're carrying a sheaf, right, you have the wheat or the corn, you bundle it up, that's a sheaf, right? So it's a bundle of fruit, vegetable. You bundle it up, you're carrying it out, and you forget one. God said, just leave it. Leave it in the field and let these groups go get it. They're going to get, and you're going to see that you can even purposely leave some in the field. I'll show you that now, but look at verse 20. 20. When thou beatest thine olive tree, thou shalt not go over the boughs again. It shall, or the boughs again. I always forget if it's boughs or boughs. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. When thou gatherest the grapes of thy vineyard, thou shalt not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command thee to do this thing. So don't forget that somebody took care of you when you were helpless. That's what he's saying. When they were in Egypt, Pharaoh did not tell the taskmasters, leave a little extra in their paycheck or, in their purse. Give them a little extra. They never got any special help. He's saying that's something I gave you when I showed up. And now he wants his people to do the same. Look at, just hold Deuteronomy, coming right back to it. Look at Ruth real quick, the book of Ruth. I trust you're familiar with the story of Ruth. It's the story of three widows, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. That all of their husbands pass. And Ruth is now working in Boaz's field. Boaz, you know what he does? He takes extra good care of this widow. Extra good care. And it's no wonder then that God used him and blessed him so much. But he knew, he heard Ruth's story and he said, let's take really good care. Ruth chapter 2, look at verse 14. Boaz said unto her, at mealtime come thou hither, and eat of the bread, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar. And she sat beside the reapers, and he reached her parched corn, and she did eat, and was sufficed, and left. He said, you come sit at the table with us. You didn't have to do that for widows, and she's a Gentile to boot. He could easily have said, you are not allowed at the table. We're not allowed to eat with you. But he said, you know what? You kind of married into the Jewish family. You've been faithful to the Jewish God. You're helping another widow, Naomi. You know what? Come sit at the table. Let's make sure you're well fed. Verse 15, and when she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not. This is before they carry the stuff out of the field. She's not getting just leftovers. She can go pick from the very best of the field. You see how Boaz is going above and beyond to help a widow. Verse 16, and let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean them, and rebuke her not. So now, purposely drop something. Pick it up and go, oops, and then just go on. Purposely go out of your way to leave a blessing for the widow. Now, to me, that is a great point to make, to challenge all of us, to say, what can we leave behind from our own budget, from our own schedule, just to be a blessing to somebody who really needs it. Come back to Deuteronomy now and get chapter 26. Just want to show you this one last place and we'll sing a little bit. Deuteronomy chapter 26 and verse 12. Deuteronomy 26:12. He says here, when thou hast made an end of tithing, all the tithes of thine increase the third year, which is the year of tithing. Give me just a second here, because the Jews actually had 3 different tithes that they had to give. There was a yearly one. There was one they gave every 3 years. It depended on what was going on. So anytime they had a harvest, they were supposed to tithe. So tithing is slightly more complicated then than it is for us now. But nevertheless, this particular tithe, every 3rd year, he says, you guys count how much has come in and then designate 10%. I want you to bring 10% for this purpose. He says in the middle of verse 12, and hast given it unto the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that they may eat within thy gates and be filled. Then thou shalt say before the Lord thy God, I have brought away the hallowed things out of mine house, and also have given them unto the Levite, unto the stranger, to the fatherless, and to the widow, according to all thy commandments which thou hast commanded me. I have not transgressed thy commandments, neither have I forgotten them. God said, I want you to budget. It's part of your budget. Right off the top, 10%. Make sure every 3 years, 10% of your money goes to that. Just to take care of people that really, really need it. Verse 14, he says, I have not eaten thereof in my mourning. He's going on. This is what a Jew would say while he's at the temple. I have not eaten thereof in my mourning, neither have I taken away aught thereof for any unclean use, nor given aught thereof for the dead. This is like to worship the dead kind of thing. But I have hearkened to the voice of the Lord my God, and have done according to all that thou hast commanded me. Look down from thy holy habitation from heaven, and bless thy people Israel, and the land which thou hast given us, as thou swarest unto our fathers, a land that floweth with milk and honey. So the Lord has built it in. If a land wants to be blessed, they need to be taking care of these groups, especially the widows. So this is why I wanted to spend a few weeks in our church just looking at this. Tonight, like I said, just a Bible study to get us familiar with how important it is to God. Guys, we covered maybe half of the verses in the Old Testament that speak directly to it. There's a lot more that could be said. But as you see, He built it into Israel's society. Make sure that the widows are taken care of. So there is an aspect the family should be taking care of a widow, right? The sons and daughters can take care. The government also has a responsibility. Israel was a government, not just a religion. But then we're going to see in the weeks to come, the church has a responsibility. So as a group, we have a plan for taking care of widows within our church. But then we also want to think about us as individuals. What could we do? Even if it's just a once-off thing here or there, what could we do to be a blessing to them? All right, that's all we're going to get for tonight on the widows.